are closed. Yes, we are live.
Let me see if we are live. দেখাচ্ছে কি? I think we are live. Yeah, it's showing. Yes. হ্যাঁ, লাইভ দেখাচ্ছে, only Parthu Pratim Rai Chaudhuri, হ্যাঁ, আমাকেও দেখা যাচ্ছে. It's okay. I think we are already live. Yeah.
Yes, we are live. There is a 20-second delay from Zoom.
Yeah, that is not a problem. সেটা তো হবেই. So we are already live, and in 2-3 minutes, we can start the discussion. Please wait for another 3 minutes, another 2 minutes maybe.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, because people will be joining. So we can just start with the formalities and all that. Just maybe Debashish, you can just switch on your video and like introduce the event.
Okay.
Tell a few words, and then I can carry on with the conversation.
Okay. Good evening, friends. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to this event by the Indian Posthumanism Network. This event introduces a book by Professor Avishek Parui, Assistant Professor of English, IIT Chennai. The book is Culture and the Literary. And today's event is a conversation between Dr. Parui and Dr. Samrat Sengupta, one of our co-founders, Associate Professor of English, Sidho Kano, Birsha University. The event is titled Writing on Memory Studies, a discussion on culture and the literary, matter, metaphor, and memory. There will be a conversation between Drs. Parui and Dr. Sengupta, followed by an open discussion with members of the Indian Posthumanism Network. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Samrat Sengupta. Samrat, it's all yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Debashish da, for kindly introducing the event. Just make sure if I am audible. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are perfectly audible.
So, I welcome you all to this wonderful occasion, and I heartily welcome Dr. Avishek Parui, who also has been a long friend and a fellow traveler in the world of scholarship. Avishek, as already Debashish da pronounced, is an assistant professor in English at IIT Chennai, IIT Madras, and associate fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is also the founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies and the principal investigator of the Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras. So, and he has authored a number of books and has recently been contracted by Orient Black Swan for a book on memory studies. His first monograph, I think, is on postmodernism, which is, I think, is already in the market. And the new book which has got published is Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, on which we are like basing our today's discussion. I congratulate Avishek for this book and welcome him on board. Thank you, Avishek, for being here. I just want to briefly introduce the book, what is the book about, and then open up the discussion, ask a few questions. It is more like a dialogue. It is not a formal event in that sense. So this book, Culture and the Literary, actually involves a good number of issues which entangle together. As you can see, the three terms, matter, metaphor, and memory, they combine. Avishek talks about literary, the notion of the literary, not literature per se, but literary as a specific form of cultural materiality, where we see literature as having the ability to transcend the structural bindings of culture, the determinations of culture, and push us towards the field of uncanny, of uncertainty, and the threshold of meaning, of the meaning-making apparatus. And it involves issues such as the technological structuring of human society, or how technology is actually making and unmaking the human subject. It also involves the relationship of the medical science, anthropology, and human subjectivity, and how the act of storytelling, the act of narrativization, can actually question these existing forms of values, and how language, with its metaphoricity, with use of metaphor, can be a vehicle of like learning and unlearning the processes of remembrances and forgetting, the processes through which we form our identity and move beyond the rigid and strict ideas and ideological bindings. So with this small introduction, I would like to ask certain questions to Avishek and open up the discussion. Your work repeatedly talks about the specific literature as a specific form of mattering in the sphere of culture. You have talked about ambivalence. Ambivalence is a key word, I think, which actually combines the entire theme of the book at various points in your book. What is the potentiality of this ambivalence with respect to the existing cultural codes operating in the society? What is the relationship between narratives and culture? Avishek.
Right. Thank you very much. At the very outset, I should thank the Indian Posthumanism Network for very kindly organizing this. It's an absolute honor to discuss my book in such a wonderful platform. Thank you, Professor Banerji. Thank you, Dr. Sengupta, who's been like you said, he's been a teacher figure, a mentor figure for me. I call him Samrat, and also my colleagues in the Indian Posthumanism Network. I think that's a very brilliant summary of the book that Dr. Sengupta just mentioned. The whole idea of ambivalence is the key, is absolutely central to the book. And I think the literary medium, the way I've engaged with it, is a very interesting medium because it can accommodate and articulate ambivalence. And by ambivalence, I don't mean the usual ontology of uncertainty. I mean ambivalence as an ontology of simultaneity, as in many valences are present together, are entangled together, without any notional hierarchy, without any notional preferential treatment, right? And that gives a very distributive quality about culture rather than a hierarchical quality of culture. And I think the literary medium is designed to be deconstructive, right? Long before Derrida came to the scene, long before post-structuralism happened, I think literature as a medium has always been deconstructive. Even the most hardcore classic realist texts, even if you go back to the Daniel Defoe's and the Moll Flanders in the earliest days of a novel, you find the novel as a medium has always had fluidity as one of the instruments through which the narration has occurred. So then that has been my attempt in terms of looking at the fluid framework of fiction, through which the notional cultural codes can be reified, can be deconstructed. And then again, the funny thing is literature, we must be a little careful about looking at literature as always subversive. That's not true. Literature can also be consolidating. Literature can be profoundly status quo. Literature can be profoundly authoritarian, at the same time being subversive. So I think this amorality of literature, the fact that it doesn't have to be subversive, it doesn't have to be status quo, this amorality of literature, apropos of politics, authoritarianism, identity, is exactly what makes it a very slippery medium. And because I also work with technology, I collaborate with scientists quite a lot, I make the argument in this book as well as elsewhere that this whole idea of ambivalence, the literature as the ambivalence engine or the machine to produce ambivalence, this gives a sense of augmentation to literature. So literature, I argue, is also a vehicle of augmented reality. So that's something we can perhaps discuss later as well. But I think you're absolutely spot on. And it's a brilliant reading on the book as well. And I'm so thankful that you've identified the central philosophical framework, which is one of ambivalence. I think your audio is not working. I can't hear you. Maybe it's just—
You're muted, Samrat.
Switch on the audio.
Oh, yeah. I've been muted. Sorry. I was just thinking, ambivalence is a central, metaphor, the central philosophical concern of this book. No doubt about that. I was also thinking the subtitle of your book, Matter, Metaphor, Memory. So how do you think these three things combine, particularly because in our thinking, we often assume that memory is something which is which has an autonomy of its own, which is a part of the centrality of the human subject. It actually flows from the self, or the notion of brain being the center of emotive activities, sentience, and in that way, it is the brain or the memory is in a way a depiction of the matter and materiality. But your book actually challenges that. So how do you do that, and how it is the role of metaphor in this entire event, and how does it connect with the non-human, and how it combines the question of the human with the question of the non-human?
Yeah, I mean, that's again a brilliant question, because if you look at the title of the book, it's Culture and the Literary. And if you notice carefully, both these are artifices, both these are artifacts. Culture is an artifact, the literary is also an artifact. But at the same time, both these artifacts have a very strong human, non-human interface, right? So culture can only operate with this interfacial quality of the human and the non-human. So culture as a human organism can evolve, but it also requires the profound non-human quality. It requires symbols, it requires objects, it requires materials. In fact, I have engaged with material engagement theory quite a lot in this book as well. And the same goes for the literary. The literary requires obviously the human mind, the human consciousness, but at the same time, there is a profound artificial quality about the literary as well. So in that interface of the organic and the inorganic, that interface between the human and the non-human, which is what connects profoundly to post-humanism as well. I think this is what makes it really interesting, has always been my focus in this book. So looking at these entities, these organisms, these ontologies as a play between the human and the non-human. And if I could just give a very cheeky, flippant allusion. I remember when I noticed that when we were making the poster for this particular event, when we were describing my affiliation, you wrote IIT Chennai. And I once thought I should correct you, maybe I should tell you it's IIT Madras, but I let it stay that way because I wanted to pick up on that. And it's interesting how the city has been renamed Chennai, like Mumbai has been renamed Mumbai, but its institutions are still holding on to the older names, right? And that I think is interesting because we must look at memory as a bi-directional activity, right? So memory is not something which is just looking backwards in time, right? Memory is also something which is very interestingly codified in order to sustain certain identities. So why do certain institutions want to hold on to the older names? So why does something like IIT Madras, which is a national institution, why does it not want to change into Chennai, right? And that has been an institutional decision. It's a policy decision in terms of holding on to the earlier identity. Now, what that means in a very interesting way is one of the paradoxes of memory studies. And I think you've touched upon that as well with your question, that we must look at memory not simply as a retrospective activity, but also as a futuristic activity. What we remember and how we remember determines not just our engagement with the past, but also our engagement with the future, how we want to carry on that past onto the future. So because legacy is a moving, dynamic thing, right? So legacy is not something which just goes behind in time. So when you talk about institutional legacies, so this resistance towards this institutions and changing from, let's say, Madras to Chennai or Bombay to Mumbai, I think it's very symbolic and very telling. That's why I wanted this to stay in a poster as well. Although I think people in my department might be a little offended that it's IIT Chennai. But I think it's a very interesting way to look at it. Why is it a city has renamed itself, but its institutions have not renamed themselves, right? So I think that tells a lot about the fluidity of memory, the relationship between memory and agency, the relationship between memory and identity preservation. But the most fundamental thing being looking at memory not just as a flow back in time, but looking at memory also as a mode through which a certain construct can be conserved and also transmitted into the future. That's what culture is all about, right? Culture is all about transmission. And this transmission can happen to the brain, the transmission can happen to neurons, but equally, the transmission can happen through signboards, through different kinds of materials around us. So again, we are back to the central question of looking at the interface of the organic and the inorganic through which memory as a transmission, memory as a verb, and that's something which I use in a way that, let's say, post-structuralists define gender as a verb. I look at memory as a verb as well, something which is happening. And of course, as we all know, people who have studied students of deconstruction, that whatever's happening is a combination of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming, right? So in that, in a way, makes the whole ontology of memory a very fluid activity, which again, a literary medium is uniquely equipped to accommodate and articulate.
Yeah, very interesting, actually, very interesting and intriguing. Particularly, there was a section where you were challenging the centrality of brain and consciousness, and you were just proposing through the neuroscience research that the way we memorize actually takes up from the last when we thought about it, remembered it. So remembrance does not flow from any original point. That I found very interesting. So it actually keeps combining, and it immediately reminded me of Heidegger's notion of gathering as a formation of the being. So we are constantly gathering from our environment. So the outside is in a way flowing inside. That is very interesting. And in this connection, I was just thinking of what can be the connection between memory and literature or the literary. Like what is the role of literature or the literariness in deploying memory? Because there are various forms of memorizing. History is a form of memorizing. The making of the monuments, the naming of the city, as you proposed, even the universities. Even Calcutta University it's still called University of Calcutta, the same way.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
and sometimes we forget about that. We call Kolkata University. So this colonial way of naming has been preserved, and it is also unpreserved vis-a-vis the name of the city. So there are many various forms of memorizing. So within these various forms of memorizing, what is the particularity of literature, or if we put it as literary? So that is what I was thinking about.
Yeah, right. So I think, I mean, again, it's a very interesting question, because we're looking at literature as an example of something which is consciousness centric. It emerges from a brain, it emerges from a creative, sentient self. But at the same time, literature, ontologically speaking, has a connective quality. It must connect to other people, right? And that's the reason why I look at literature as one of the earliest forms of what we now call social media, right? Let's say someone publishes a novel which is read by everyone, a community, right? So what is happening is literature becomes by default a device through which consciousness can become distributive in quality, right? A consciousness can have an added dimension of distributive quality. So long before social network was born, the literature may be defined as one of the earliest forms of social networking, right? Where people can talk to each other, connect to each other through a novel, how they read a novel, how they discussed a novel, how do they engage with a character, etc. Right? And also, the other thing literature does, and there's a lot of research on that as well, is a very complex relationship between literature as an empathy engine, right? As something which produces empathy or trains us to empathize. The reason why we root for certain characters while reading a story, the reason why we're sad when a character dies in a particular narrative, is because the very medium of literature, the figurative medium, the metaphoricity, that whole engagement, the design, the defamiliarization of language. But what it does at a very fundamental level is that it trains us into empathy. It empathizes. There's an empathetic bond with the reader and the story, right? And that happens at a very micro level. Let's say, I am reading a book and I am establishing a relationship of empathy with the story. But it also happens at a macro level. We know of stories of how people write letters to Conan Doyle requesting him to bring back Sherlock Holmes, right? We know of stories of how writers get requests from readers in order to have a certain character promoted in a certain way. So that empathy can also become collective in quality, right? And that, I think, is the unique feature of literature. The micro neural quality of literature, me reading a book in my private room, but at the same time, literature as a public site, right? A novel because the birth of a novel is a very public event, because a novel could not have been conceived without a printing press, without the apparatus through which it can be distributed, without the clientele. So I think that public-private interplay the literature offers is key to our understanding of memory.
Thank you. I was just because and there are determinations in every kind of communication. I think, as you already said, that it's not so easy that literature is always subversive. It is always, it always pushes us towards uncertainty. It also has its own forms of essentialism, mobility to move beyond those essentialism. And connected to it, I was just wondering about your notion of the literary. From literary, you have used the culture and the literary, not literature. So can there be the element of literary in other modes of communication? It's just a random question which comes in my mind. Like, what will be your?
Yeah, I mean, see, the literary mode of communication is always already there, right? Ever since we as primates have learned to lie, ever since we as primates have learned to tell stories, we have always already used the literary mode. The invention of irony, for instance, ever since we knew to say something by saying something else, by meaning something else, right? That slipperiness of saying something and meaning something else. You can go back as far back to the Greeks, Plato banning the poet, the Aaron, etc., because he says something and means something else. So I think that has been one of the most ancient attributes of communication, right? If you look at the literary mode of communication as a slippery play of meaning, meaningfulness and meaninglessness, I think that has just been there since the beginning of time. And of course, that has got more complex manifestations. We can sort of identify certain epochs, the birth of a novel, the birth of the printing press, digital media, etc. And of course, we come to the era of what is now known as post-truth, although I have a lot of reservation against the term. I think it's a very problematic term, post-truth. We need to be careful while defining it in a way that's normally defined. But I think that literary medium, the literary mode of communication, we mustn't just look at literature. And you're absolutely right, because I could have mentioned culture and literature, but then that sort of institutionalizes the medium, first of all, which is a problem. And second, I think it makes it a bit reductionist, because a literary medium is not just limited to literature per se. The literary medium is there in journalism. The literary medium is there in informal conversations. The literary medium is profoundly there in politics. I mean, we know of the politics of oration, how you can mobilize a mob, how you can play up the anger and emotions of the audience. So these have always been there since the beginning of time. So I think the literary medium is something which is more distributed, and it connects to very complex codes of communication, which includes politics, which includes medicine, which includes philosophy, but which also includes the banality of everydayness. I think the literary is something which we experience every day through our communications. So that's something which has always been there since the beginning of human communication.
So it is in a way a part of the communication as well. Communication doesn't essentially mean like a simple process of encoding and decoding, but in the form of decoding, you also create new sets of meanings are produced, I think. So I will just keep the discussion to another direction maybe. I was just thinking about, since you mentioned technology, I have certain questions about the technological aspect of communication. Particularly, you have done a close reading of Manto's stories, and as it happens, as a reader, Manto's stories are very close to me. I've been reading them for a long period of time. So, my engagement is different, and I found it very interesting the way you actually talked about the machinic quality of human emotions, and how in a moment of violence, in a moment of crisis, in a moment of traumatized memories which come back to people, and that man becomes like a machine, human mind becomes like a machine. So I was just thinking about this. How will you talk about this machinic element? Does it make the human post-human in a wrong way of the word, wrong sense of the word, in a negative way? It becomes post-human or over-human, almost verging to the point of monstrosity. Or is there still any kind of hope? Like this Manto's description of what you call cold and clinical bureaucracy and its effect on human mind. Do you think that his writings, in a way, makes us conscious and how to deal with this kind of machinic conversion or perversion of human mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, because I think Manto obviously has been critiqued for various reasons. I mean, his depiction of the human body, the depiction of the violated female body. But I think what I am more interested in when I look at Manto is the use of form that Manto has, the narrative form, the narrative design that Manto espouses in his writing. And I think that is very deliberately minimalist in quality. I'm sure you know this much better than I do, because you're an avid reader of Manto. And I think that minimalism in the narrative technique of Manto is almost journalistic, very bare, very minimalist. There's almost no metaphoricity in Manto, right? It's just very, very hard, cold, dry, etc. So I think that, in a way, is a very interesting depiction of the bureaucracy, the clinical machine through which human bodies get guillotined and cut, etc. That is a very interesting depiction. So I think we need to pay more attention in terms of how the form of Manto is more reflective of the tragedy rather than the content, because the stories sometimes end midway. The stories are suspended in a narrative way. The stories are very open-ended. We don't get to know what happens after, and there's this very sinister quality about Manto's ending, right? So the suspension of Manto is very sinister. There's this very cold, sinister quality in which a story is let go, right? And I think that letting go of the story is interesting. He just lets it go, and it's just upon the reader in terms of what happens. It's up to our imagination. But in a real craft of Manto, if I were to define it that way, lies in his control of the form, the way he uses the form, very episodic, very journalistic, very minimalist. I think that becomes, and that connects very well with what we call episodic memory, right? In terms of memory coming back in a flash and then disappearing in a flash, right? That non-linear quality of memory, not something which can be accessed at will, but memory is something which comes not just to the brain, but it floods the body and then leaves the body, right? The very embodied corporeal quality of memory and memorylessness, that is also there. If you look at Toba Tek Singh, for example, it's a very corporeal depiction of memory as well as memorylessness. And the body begins to get more and more filled with time. I mean, that magnificent symbol in the end where the feet begin to swell because more and more time are getting in the feet, as it were. So then that corporeality of memory, that very fleshly quality of memory, is brilliantly depicted in the narrative form of Manto. So I think I, as a reader of Manto, as a student of memory studies, I pay more attention to the formal design of Manto stories. Because, first of all, we are not reading the stories in original, the originals in Urdu. So we are losing something already at the level of language, at the level of metaphors, at the level of lyric. So I think as people who are sort of twice removed, as it were, from the real site of the story production, the formal quality of Manto is something that attracts me more as a student of memory studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I was just wondering about this machinic quality, which you repeatedly raise across your book. It comes again and again, because it has a certain kind of post-human twist, and not always in the positive sense. Like we think that sometimes we assume that post-human is something which is a positive force of going beyond the human. So do you think that, it's again a random question, that we should do away with the humanism, or post-human studies is a way of returning to the humanism in a new way, which is not anthropocentric, non-anthropocentric way of approaching the humanism in the sense of having certain transcendental values we all believe in, the values of liberalism, the values of equality, liberty, and fraternity? Or do you think that, humanism should be done away with and we should invite the post-human?
I mean, it's again a very complex question, and I'm not sure if I have a neat answer to it. But I think what we now call post-humanism, it has a very rich history. It's a very long history. It just didn't suddenly start after the Second World War. I mean, we can go far back to Renaissance, even earlier, really. I mean, think of the Greek myths. I mean, Daedalus, Icarus. I mean, the people building machines to fly in the air and then getting penalized by the gods. That fight against authority with machines. I mean, that has always been there since the beginning of human imagination. And Prometheus is a profoundly post-human figure. I mean, if you look at the myths way back in time. So in that anxiety and aspiration, that play between anxiety and aspiration through the machine, I mean, if that is a very blunt but perhaps useful definition of post-human, the anxiety and aspiration apropos of machines, apropos of the non-human, that has always been there since the beginning of time, that desire to appropriate the fire, the desire to appropriate the wheel, the desire to appropriate the wings through which we can fly, etc. So that has a very long and rich history. And I think we need to be a little careful while looking at the post-human as something which is strictly new or celebratory or something which will liberate us suddenly. I mean, it's not that simple, really, because what we now call post-human, these coordinates, these codes have always been there since the beginning of human imagination, I think. So my very inadequate answer to your very complex question is that we need to look at the humanism and the post-humanism, not necessarily as dualistic categories, but as entangled categories. Because we need to remember the high point of humanism, if you go back, let's say Enlightenment, etc., was also the high point of what we can consider the post-human, right? I mean, think of something as canonical as Christopher Marlowe's theater, right? If you read Dr. Faustus, right? I mean, that in a way is a celebration of humanism. It's like the birth of man, the center of man, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, there's also the aspiration towards his cyborg figure, right? That is also there, that I want to transcend this and become something else. And if you remember the end of Faustus, there's an explosion the human explodes into something. So you can connect it to the writings of Nobarun, for instance, the Fataru. What happens to Faustus in the end? He just explodes as what we now can call the Fataru, right? So I think the humanists and the post-humanists should not be seen as ontological opposites, but as coordinates and parameters which have always been there as entangled categories throughout human imagination, I think.
Yeah. So humanism existed at the level of ideology by excluding the post-human, but it always already haunted the sphere of the human in certain ways. I was also thinking about another aspect of technology, which you mentioned in your book, referring to Foucault, that is the formation, the technologies of the self, the governmentality, the apparatus of governmentality, and how the governmental apparatus is creating reality. So production literature is something which makes us conscious about the reality as a kind of production. I was also thinking about Aristotle's rhetoric, and where he was trying to separate between rhetoric and truth and its effect on literature. When he was writing his Poetics, there is a connection between poetics and rhetoric, because there is this kind of objection from Plato that what is true form of communication and what is false form of communication. But it always happens that in the governmental apparatus, truth is something which is produced, and I think literary media makes us conscious about it. So my question is, in the present context, again going back to the debate of AI, and I was also thinking about the concept of live streaming, which we are having now. The social media gives an effect of being live always, and it erases the fact that we are into a medium. So in this context, how would you place literature? Because your engagement with literature and technology was fascinating. I was just thinking if you can say a few words about these two areas.
Yeah, I mean, see, there is this interesting quality about the digital world, right? That nothing ever dies in a digital world. There's a sort of deathless quality about the digital. So in fact, that's one research I find myself increasingly attracted to, the deathless digital, right? Nothing goes away in the digital world. I mean, any image can resurface, any message. I mean, we can see how celebrities get into trouble these days because they're advertising for something else. And then 20 years ago, they did something else. People dig it up and embarrass them, etc. But I think that quality of deathlessness, which the digital does so well, is interesting because it adds a dimension to the literary as well. And that's something which, again, the argument that I make is the literary medium was perhaps the first invention towards deathlessness. Right, because what we now call the deathless digital is like, no, the human might die, but the images will stay. The person may die, but the tweet will stay, whatever way you want to look at it. Right, but literature got there first, in a sense, because stories never go away. Right, and what we now classify as a canon is, in a way, an anticipation of what we now call the digital. Right, because once we enter the canon, you'll not go away. I mean, Milton will stay. Satan or Milton will stay. It'll keep having different kinds of figures. Different Shakespearean heroes will find their place in Bollywood, Tollywood, Collywood. So the different kind of deathless quality of literature, the canonical literature which becomes the canon. And that, in a way, is very interestingly comparable to what we call the digital today, right? And that, of course, profoundly connects the post-human and memory studies, because we're looking at memory studies. Memory, in a way, as a bidirectional activity. So not just preserving the past, but preserving the past in a way which can flow into the future. So there's a very profoundly futuristic quality about memory. It can be something as banal and vulgar, like, let's say, someone learning to ride a bicycle, and that memory will help the person to ride the bicycle, like literally move into the future in a certain sense. And again, that connects with the post-human as well, because the very idea of the post-human is that there's something beyond the human, and the beyond human are connected, right? So there is nothing which is, purely human. The human is always already beyond human, right? That is the argument the post-human can take. So there is also the futuristic quality about the post-human, right? So if you look at the very academic definition of posthumanism. You find that if you read any of the posthuman big figures, Hales or Haraway, there's very future-looking quality. In fact, I mean, this is something that I've always been intrigued with. There's one phenomenon called futurism, I think, in Italy, something around the Second World War. I'm not very sure. Futurism, which sort of celebrated machines, velocity. And there's a guy called Marinetti, I think, an Italian philosopher, who wrote a manifesto called the Futuristic Manifesto, etc., etc. So they're talking about the radio, the motorbike, the fast-moving cars, etc. But if you look at the framework, is in a way it's trying to capture time, right? It's trying to move ahead in time and anticipate time, and this brings me to one of the definitions of literature that I use in my studies these days, that we need to look at literature, not just, or the literary, not just as an act of representation, but also an act of anticipation. So literature also helps us anticipate the future, right? So in a way, that's also interesting, how that connects to the post-human, the digital, etc. So in these, again, we can look at the digital as a natural evolution of the literary medium, right? We can think of the novel as perhaps something which anticipated what we now call social network, what we now call live streaming, etc. Book clubs, people reading together, storytellers coming together in a cave-in, for instance, the Decameron, Chaucerian kind of things. I mean, look at Canterbury Tales, for example. People killing time by telling stories to each other, right? So that itself becomes some kind of a fluid platform through which you play with imagination, connect together. So then that has a very strong legacy. And in literature, the post-human and the memory and the machines, they all connect together in a very interesting evolutionary diagram through which we can study these things, I think.
Yeah. It reminds me of a lot of things, of course. Also the spectrality of memory, the spectral gaze of the past into the future, all these things. And also Derrida and Stigler on the spectrality of communication, the systems of communication, all these things comes up in my mind. And I find it very interesting when you talk about literature as a form of augmented reality, because augmented reality is also a part of technology. And I think literature also anticipates, as you said, it anticipates the deathlessness of digital communication. It also anticipates of going beyond the real, the augmented reality. I was just thinking in another direction about the way you talked about the West and Wested identity, the West and trash, and its relationship with human subjectivity. A certain kind of dehumanization you already discussed with respect to Manto, but there is another twist when you talk about Fano and others, when you talk about the idea of West, the relationship of man with West, where we want to discard or control the object and make it and reduce it to in a kind of use. This reductionism is also a part of the technological apparatus we belong to, I think. And it reminds me of not only the Black studies, but also in our country, the Dalit studies, where the Dalit, the agency of the Dalit is denied and they're reduced to, you talked about in connection with Agamben and Bowman. But Bowman in a way, I think it talks about the, vested lives in modernity. But this is a practice which is transcendental, which has been all along human history. So what can be the connection between this memory and the West? I was just thinking about it.
Yeah, you touched upon something very foundational. Spectrality, right? Something which is dead, but not quite dead. And Derrida picks up on that in Spectres of Marx. And interestingly, I'm sure you remember this, that he uses the metaphor of Hamlet's father, right? The ontological figure who never quite goes away, but never quite dead, but never quite there, in the middle as well. The play between the periphery and the center, right? So I think literature is a very useful medium through which this undeadness can be studied. Things which are undead. Spectrality is one of the foundational qualities of literature, because literature can create characters which don't exist. And I think I make that claim in this book, slightly philosophical claim, looking at fiction as a spectral medium, because fiction as a medium is a play between fantasy and reality, right? So I think we need to be careful in defining fiction as fantasy. Fiction isn't fantasy. So fiction is an entanglement of what is there with what can be there, what could have been there. So all these different factors come into being. But I think the notion of the waste is very important because, and again, we need to be a little careful about looking at waste as strictly a post-technological artifact. It's not. Again, it goes back in time. We can go as far back as the earliest days. I mean, think of Mahabharata, for instance. The depiction of the dead bodies after the war, in terms of the corpses, the humans turn into waste, and the landscape of Kurukshetra after the war is a profound example of almost carnivalesque waste, so to speak. Right. So I think the idea of the waste is interesting because it connects, and of course, when you talk about race studies, we talk about Dalit studies, then it connects profoundly to questions around identity, social identity, cultural identity, political identity, etc. But I think what it comes down to at a very fundamental level is the politics of production, deproduction, and reproduction, which I think literature does very well. Literature not just gives us an example of production, it's also an example of deproduction, right? The creation of otherness, the creation of absence, and that connects with ambivalence as well. Literature can also accommodate absence. I think that's what I think makes it so spectral as well. What is not foregrounded in society, what is not foregrounded in public discourse can be there as a liminal presence in literature, right? I think, again, the liminality of literature as a medium is very useful because it automatically equips it to talk about these characters, these presences, these others, the marginal, the periphery, whether it's a caste question, whether it's a race question, whether it's a gender question, but it can, as a medium, tease out this play between the powerful and the powerless, between the there and the not there, between the present and the non-present, right? So this very playful quality of literature as a medium makes it uniquely equipped to depict these examples of deproduction. So how is a human deproduced into an entity? If you talk about Fano, for example, the famous passage in Fano, Look Mama a Negro, where that moment of freezing, that moment of sort of reification, racial reification, right? So I think the metaphor of the blackness that Fano talks about, the fact of blackness, but the fact of blackness is also the metaphor of blackness. What does blackness metaphorically present in a white space, right? So these become very interesting ways through which one can study very serious social questions. So that's why I think reading novels, reading poetry, reading literature can train us to understand society perhaps better than reading history books on certain occasions. So,
yeah. And it's brilliant in the sense you always connected your research with materiality, the matter, and you never moved out of the matter. And in a way that also concerns the question of the body. Body comes repeatedly in your work as something of a central concern, but not body as isolated from the environment, but in a post-human way of entangled bodies with the body itself. So what do you think is the relationship between literature and the marginalized, ailing body? You've already pronounced it to some extent, but I was just, if you can elaborate for the viewers a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex question because the body is central, because we know even at the very hardcore scientific way to look at cognition. I mean, every cognition is embodied cognition. So cognition is a corporeal activity. So we have moved away from the Cartesian quality of cognition, looking at this sort of brain-centered model of cognition. In fact, I mean, we know through different philosophers and neuroscientists such as Antonio Damasio, Joseph Ledoux, and you can think of many examples as well, who are actually very strongly highlighting the embodied corporeal quality of cognition. So I think the body as a sort of scientific evidence is that they look at the body as the site of cognition, through which cognition operates, distributes, produces, reproduces, etc. So in the ailing body, or so let's say the memoryless body, or the body losing memory gradually, the body getting weak gradually, it also has a very interesting spatio-temporal quality. And I think Manto is a very good example of that. If you look at Toba Tek Singh, here we have an ailing body which is being abandoned by time. And he sort of wants to hold on to time. And Manto does it very symbolically by saying, look how the feet are getting swollen, because he doesn't want to release time. He wants to hold on to time. But I think one can look at examples in, let's say, Samuel Beckett's theater as well, in terms of looking at how Beckett represents a tram figure, how Beckett represents, let's say, something like Krapp's Last Tape, where someone wants to hold on to memory, but then his body becomes a site of loss. So I think what literature does very interestingly is look at the body as a site of production, preservation, but also as a site of deproduction, right? Looking at the decaying body. And there are many examples, I mean, Kafka, Manto, Beckett. In fact, one genre that I'm increasingly interested in through memory studies as well as through posthumanism is the absurd theater. If you look at absurd theater, how the absurd body, the sort of paranormal body or the differently abled body becomes interesting, because it gives a very interesting depiction of a different way to engage with space and time, right? The body is a site of abnormal production. The body is a site of liquidation. I think that's one very interesting metaphor, which I find myself very attracted to, liquidation, something which is getting shut down, right? It's a business metaphor, but then something which is being liquidated by space and time, right? So I think looking at the ailing body, the body losing cognitive control, the body losing cultural agency, the body losing language, the body losing memory, that liminal transition from the able to the differently abled, I think that's something which literature can do very well. And there are many examples, I just cited a few, but I'm sure you know more of these examples, where the transition from meaningful materiality to meaningless entity can be shown, that transition. I think Manto's Toba Tek Singh is perhaps the greatest short story I've read on this, that transition from meaningful materiality to meaningless entity, and how that transition of the body connects to a geopolitical transition as well, right? Between a village called Toba Tek Singh into two new nations which are suddenly cropped out of the village, and the village gets chopped out and amputated from memory. It's a story about amputation, Toba Tek Singh. That's why the limb is there. The limb has to be amputated, and it gets amputated in the end, it dies in the no man's land. So literature, I think, is a very interesting medium for this liminal transition between meaningfulness and meaninglessness through the body.
Thank you, Abhishek. I think it is time to open the discussion to our panel, like co-panelists and the members of IPN present here. I think Monirul has to leave for another meeting. So I'm just opening it up to, and I'll ask Monirul to drop his first question, then we can carry on with the discussion. Monirul, if you have any question, please, have your intervention, comment, question.
Okay, I mean, thank you, Samrat. It was wonderful listening to both of you, and Avishek, especially, your exposition. I mean, the way you explain things, it's intriguing, and really, we are delighted to have you here. I don't have much of a question, because you see, I have not read the book in full, actually. I have read the introduction and, the chapter on technology. Okay, only those two sections I have read so far. But, I would just like to make a point and invite you to comment on it if possible. What I was reading the book, I saw your concern, as Samrat said, with the literary. Okay. Now, when, and then the way you have defined literary as a place where, say, the space where the matter and the metaphor, the real and the imaginary, the virtual and the real, in other words, gets blurred. Okay, so this blurring of the matter and the metaphor, that characterizes the literary. It's something, that also characterizes our life, say, as we are living now. Okay, especially after the emergence of different digital media, especially different kind of virtual social media platforms. So, life in a sense, to use it in your way, life in a sense has become literary. In a sense, has gone literary. Because of this blurring of the virtual and the real, of the matter and the metaphor. Okay. Now, I have been thinking, if we are what kind of, say, implication this literary has for, this turn, say, in our society has for culture, what implication it has for culture. I mean, this whole thing going in a sense literary, because we are living the literary in a sense. The other thing that I have been thinking is whether, that is something that came to my mind when I was reading your introduction as well as the chapter, that whether the post-human, becomes a kind of, say, equal to the literary. I mean, whether we can find some equation between the post-human and the literary in some sense. Okay, so if we are living the literary, then whether post-human is the literary in some sense. Okay, I hope I have made some sense. So please, if you could comment on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for your question. I think it's a very interesting question. The post-human literary. If I understand you correctly, I think this is what Dr. Samrat was also mentioning. We're not talking about literature per se, but we're looking at the literary medium. So I think if I could just use the word storytelling instead of the literary, the mode through which storytelling happens. I think the post-human literary, again, I might be offending some scholars over here, but I don't think the post-human literary is a new phenomenon. It is something which goes back in time, and I was just talking about the ancient myths. If you look at the earliest myths invented by man, the Prometheus myth, the Icarus myth, the Daedalus myth, there's always been this very interesting relationship between storytelling, aspiration, and a machine, which is not there yet. I think that is interesting. Something, trying to aspire for something which is not there yet. And I just define the literary as an act of anticipation as well. So we're looking at literary not just as an act of representation, but it's a representation which helps us anticipate what is about to come as well. It trains us in anticipation as well. So I think the post-human literary, in my mind, is actually quite tautological in quality. Because if you look at the post-human as something which is, the human as well as beyond the human, that constant play between the human and the non-human without prioritizing one over the other. So that sort of non-hierarchical element is also interesting. Because if you prioritize the non-human over the human, then you end up counter-essentializing, don't you? Right. So I think post-human is obviously quite anti-essentialism in that sense as well, that play between the human and the non-human without prioritizing one over the other. So I think the literary as a medium has always had a slightly post-humanist component to it, right? Because if you take a look at the very banal material way, the novel has to be written. It is written by a person, written by a subject, written by an imagination, etc. But it needs to take an artificial form. It needs to take a shape, and then it needs to go out and become an artifice, which is to be consumed and transmitted and read and interpreted by not just that generation, if it's good enough, also by the subsequent generation. So the novel is also the good novel, the classical novel, the canonical literary work is in a way a deathless cyborg, isn't it? Because it gets passed on in time. We're still reading Hamlet today. We're still interpreting Hamlet today. We're still reading Dickens today, trying to connect that to what's happening in different parts of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So that deathless transmission quality literature has, that the medium of literature has, makes it a profoundly post-human engine in a certain sense. And the reason why I use the word engine is because I'm thinking of someone like Jonathan Sawdey, who has this wonderful book on the Renaissance called The Engines of Imagination. And that's why I think the post-human era didn't just begin after Second World War with a digital network, et cetera. It can go back in time. And the Renaissance is full of post-human, very, very supreme, solid post-human examples. Because that is like also the point where humanism is flourishing, but also the point where man's aspiration towards the non-human is getting, flamboyantly presented through art, to theater, to drama, etc. That's why I'm careful to not look at humanism and post-humanism as ontological opposites, but as, ontologies which have always sort of informed each other in very complex ways. So I think the literary post-human is a very solid entity, and I think it's something which is not new. It has always been there since the beginning of the literature as a device through which man can connect and disconnect and transmit culturally. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I find it very interesting in the sense, actually, when I teach Dr. Foster's to my students, I always see, that post-human possibilities in Foster's, and that is what you have been talking about. And same is true about, say, the Prometheus Legion. I mean,
and yet all these are poster boys of humanism, if you think about it, right? Foster's is like the poster boy, the brand of humanism. I mean, everyone talks about Foster's as that poster boy, and yet so profoundly post-humanist as well. And how one literary text can accommodate that together.
Yeah, thank you, Abhishek. We can take Chris Chappell's question. Chris, can you just switch on your video and audio and ask the question to Abhishek? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was a fascinating presentation, and I was very edified by reading what had been shared with us. And I wanted to return to the question of the body and applaud your distinction between the Cartesian removed body and the lived embodiment of true human experience, and sort of make more of a suggestion and a comment than ask a question, but I think you can probably respond as if it is a question. So I'm thinking particularly of the Mahabharata and the story of Amba, and how her hate keeps her young, and how she moves into this other embodiment through which she is able to enact her intended deed. There's a sense of tragedy, and there's this fluidity. Talk about liquidation. She liquidates this wonderful body that she had to take up a different body of a different gender. And I'm wondering if within your scope, if you've begun to sort of bring in some of the richness of Mahabharata literature, Yoga Vasishta literature, even the Upanishads vis-a-vis the definitions, multiple definitions of body.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I haven't read the Upanishads as well as I would like to, but the Mahabharata is a text that I'm increasingly interested in terms of looking at the post-human body. Because, like you said, the body in Mahabharata is so fluid. People dress up differently. There's also so much of cross-gender dressing in Mahabharata as well. I mean, the alpha male dresses up as a female and dances in a court. The great warrior takes up a chef's job. So there's all kind of fluid, transitions through caste, gender happening, but also at a very fundamental biological level as well. I mean, the whole idea of the sex change takes place so many times in the Mahabharata. But I think, and also in terms of looking at the violent body or the violated body, the body which is mutilated. Because if you take a look at the violence of Mahabharata, it's a very complex performance. It's not just killing someone off, but also there's a grammar of violence as well, which is enacted over and over again. And I think I just mentioned or touched upon the body of the non-human body, looking at the land as a body as well. What happens to Kurukshetra at the end of the war, right? It's almost like a post-apocalyptic kind of a site. And I think Samrat's question about the waste becomes really interesting. So the production of this grand spectacle of waste through the mixing of the human and the non-human, and how the soil of Kurukshetra becomes. And in fact, there's some interesting study. I just attended a seminar recently where memory studies scholars are looking at memory not from a anthropological or anthropocentric perspective, but looking at, let's say, memory of a mountain or memory of a battlefield. Let's say, if you take the example of Indian history, the memory of a terrain like the Panipat, for example, right, where so many great battles were fought. I mean, people sort of came in from the Kandahar and entered India. So what happens if someone does a soil study? And then what does it reveal in terms of memory? It's a very complex entity, not strictly anthropocentric, but also bringing in, nature's memory, the terrain's memory, etc. So I think the Mahabharata offers a fascinating example of looking at memory and the body from anthropocentric as well as more complex perspectives. But the Upanishad is something I haven't read, so but I should. Thank you for that suggestion. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Abhishek, and thank you everybody for Samrat for that wonderful conversation you had. I'd like to chip in for a little bit at this point. I'm really intrigued by the fact that you're teaching at IIT Madras. I'm an IIT dropout myself, dropout from IIT Kharagpur. And the fact is that, just to think about literary, and culture and technology, which is a really strong part of your book, in fact, and to think about situating this in a technological institute, in my time, it would be unthinkable. And there was a humanities department, but it was really ornamental. It was something people had to take, and they wanted to just pass by it as soon as they could. But I always thought that that's exactly where the deep humanities have to be situated, so people can actually reflect about what is technology, what is the meaning of technology. So I think it's really, I'd welcome even a short comment on that. And what's your experience of teaching at IIT in terms of what's the relevance of this study to the Technological Institute? And the other, I have a couple of other questions. Let me field them, and then you can take them as you wish. The other question is, of course, related to that, related to technology studies. The way that Samrat mentioned, and you also mentioned in your book, the way by which Foucault turns the whole question of technology into this deeper notion of the four technologies, that the technology of production, of codes, of power, as well as the technologies of the self. In a way, one may say the literary is involved in all of them. It's part of the technology of production. It's part of the economic machine. It really, as you point out so well, is all about the refashioning of codes, the manipulation of codes. It's about, to some extent, it's about governmentality. And it's also about introspection and affect. So I think technologies of the self, you bring that out, you're very provocative, how the literary is a technology of the self. I'd like you to think about that and, to talk to us a little bit more about that. I think, why don't we go with these questions to start with?
Sure. Thank you for that. That's absolutely brilliant, because one of the philosophers that I study quite closely in my engagement with cognitive studies is Andy Clark. And he has this very interesting 4E models of cognition: the embedded, the embodied, the inactive, and the extended, the 4Es. And I think the embedded, obviously, the neural side of cognition, what happens in the brain. The embodied is how the body acts as a cognitive site. The inactive is the performative, and the extended is a really complex bit where it becomes prosthetic in quality. And I think it's perhaps more true than ever before today, where we are our smartphones. I mean, in terms of our smartphones remember for us, other sophisticated devices like Alexa, who suggest what we should do, can do, blah blah blah. So I think that makes the whole ontology of memory very prosthetic in quality, like performative and prosthetic in quality, and that also begins to affect our motor social behavior. And I think one of the challenges, as well as one of the beauties of memory studies, is that one needs to be very careful in inhabiting the interface between the motor and the social, because memory is motor as well as social. And one never knows when the motor ends and the social begins, and they so connect in very complex ways. And if we go back in time, and I think Samrat, I perhaps you as well, we belong to a generation which sort of saw the smartphone come, or the mobile phone come. And I think prior to the mobile phone, prior to the smartphones, the very grammar of memory was very different. And one could remember phone numbers, several phone numbers. One could rattle off, mother's number, father's number, relative's number, landline numbers, which were like 7, 8 digits, so not very easy, right? But then what we now experience today is an absolute failure of memory. And if you are to remember a phone number, often a very dear ones, our spouse, our father or mother, just the requirement is absent, because the requirement is absent, because we have machines remembering for us. So I think that becomes an interesting way in which a certain phenomenon of memory begins to get erased entirely. And that begins to affect it at very motor level. So I'm thinking of a generation like, let's say, my son's generation, who will never need to remember any number, right? And the absence of the need will affect the human brain perhaps in very, very motor ways, very metabolic motor ways, in terms of, because there's no social need to do that. So the neural need also goes away. I mean, that's a terrible phrase, neural need, but you know what I mean. But I think this is really interesting, because the literary device, as you very correctly pointed out, is something which is embedded. We can read about consciousness and James Joyce, epiphany, stream of consciousness, etc., etc. It is also embodied. It has a shape. It is the book. You can hold it, whether it's a Kindle or not. It is inactive. It is performing certain rituals of cognition, drama, human episodes, etc., and is also extended, because it flows from generation to generation through different forms. Because if you think of the literary again, there was a big panic whether the Kindle will kill the book, right? Or whether the new technologies of reading will do away with the book as a matter. But it hasn't happened. So we can see how the book has existed. In fact, book sales have consistently gone up even after the Kindles have appeared. So I think these are very complex questions, and this connects very interestingly to the whole idea of consciousness and materiality. Because, I think I've had this discussion with Samrat earlier as well. We need to be very careful about glamorizing or refine the literary as an act of abstraction, because it isn't. The literary isn't an act of abstraction. The literary is a profoundly, perhaps a vulgar materialist category, right? It has always required a form. It has always required a shape. It has always required an artifice, which has to be transmitted, consumed, etc., etc. So I think that whole idea of the literary as something which can reify as well as refashion cultural codes, and sometimes simultaneously, right? I think the most complex works of literature are the works in which we don't quite know whether the social codes are being subverted or consolidated. And my favorite example of that is Jane Austen, right? I mean, if you read Pride and Prejudice, it's so fine. I mean, you don't quite know whether the institution of marriage is being satirized or being celebrated. And that liminality is just delicious. And one has to be a writer of the highest order in order to do that, I think. So I think the literary as a device is very complex in terms of how it transmits across cultural mediums.
Yeah, wonderful. And how about the question regarding teaching at IIT Madras?
Right, yes. So I'm fascinated to know that you went to IIT Kharagpur as well. And perhaps I can say this with a little degree of confidence that things may have become a little bit better for the literary people. There are two ways of looking at it. On one hand, there is this fetishization of literature that takes place as well. where, all our science colleagues and technology colleagues, they sort of expect you to be Haruka Murakami, and the whole idea of teaching literature means you must be writing poetry, doing esoteric things, etc., which is nice till a point, and then it begins to get on your nerves. But I think there's something, there's also a lot of sincere and solid attempts to collaborate. I mean, I think, for instance, I can speak for myself in IIT Madras. We have a Center for Memory Studies, and there's a lot of quality collaboration which comes from the sciences as well. Like, for instance, we often work with the different XR labs in Chennai, people who work in augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, etc. TCS has a lovely lab over here in Chennai, and also some of our colleagues that run these labs. Because I think what we have begun to understand is that these disciplines, they are essentially doing the same thing. They're looking at how reality is processed and consumed, and also how reality can be refashioned, right? The whole refashioning of reality, either through technology or through the literary defamiliarization, is essentially doing the same thing in terms of teaching us and experiencing or offering us experience through which a refashioning of reality can take place. So I think that has some very solid convergence points in terms of looking at consciousness, in terms of looking at the distributive quality of consciousness, but also the good old quality of looking at the human brain and the body and the subject as something which is always interfacial in quality. Right. So, I mean, interface studies, I don't know if it exists, but I think it should. Interface studies, I think, is a domain that might emerge at some point in not too distant future through these different collaborations where scientists and storytellers come together and study these very basic, fundamental human cultural things closely.
Thank you. I think I'll defer now to Samrat, who may be able to take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think we should take a few questions. There are not much, or maybe a couple of questions from the audience. Like Orko Dotto has asked a question. What is the nature of relationship of memory and politics? This is from YouTube. What is the nature of the relationship of memory and politics? And then a connected question: how does it ascribe value to something and create other in the process? So,
yeah,
that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a loaded question, isn't it? Memory and politics, because the whole politics of memory and the memory of politics. I mean, this is a very interesting interplay, which connects to something I maybe should have mentioned, but I did not, and I forgot to mention, which is very ironical, because it's actually about forgetting, right? Because we need to pay very close attention in memory studies to the phenomenon of forgetting. And of course, forgetting is not innocent, like metaphors, which are never innocent. Forgetting can be an act of production. Forgetting can be produced. Forgetting can be constructed, manipulated. And of course, forgetting has profound epistemic significance. Forgetting can have profound political significance. It can have profound cultural significance. What gets forgotten becomes very, very interesting. And, the whole ontology of the political, in terms of how political narratives are created, co-created, decreated, and recreated, it's almost always an interplay of remembering and forgetting, or shall we say, reification and erasure, right? So in terms of how certain narratives get reified into ideology, into propaganda, and what have you. But at the same time, these acts of reification are quite metonymic in quality, right? Because certain things also get pruned out, certain things get forgotten. And interestingly, I use the word chunking in my book. In politics as well as in memory, things get chunked in as well as chunked out. And I was very fascinated. It's one of my very few eureka moments as a researcher, where I realized that the same metaphor of chunking was used by neuroscientists as well as by cognitive narratologists. So someone like David Herman, who talks about storytelling as a cultural phenomenon, he used the word chunking in terms of certain codes get chunked in and become fairy tales, become ghost stories, become cultural values, etc. But equally, certain things get chunked out. And then you have someone like Joseph Ledoux, hardcore neuroscientist who works on anxiety, fear, the brain, etc., who also tells us that memory is all about chunking. You chunk in certain information and then you also chunk out, because every act of chunking is like drawing a map. It'll always have a border where certain things get included and certain landscapes get excluded, right? So I think politics of memory, we need to take a very close look at chunking. And one of my go-to texts about this is Milan Kunderas' Book of Laughter and Forgetting, which talks about the communist Czechoslovakia and its transition to a post-communist Czechoslovakia, and how that transition is never complete. There's always a spectral, I think Samrat was mentioning this, a spectral quality about the architecture, about the lane, about the name of a figure, which never quite goes away. So I think when you look at the relationship between memory and politics, we need to take a look at forgetting very, very closely, almost as a political device, almost as an epistemic device, which needs to be studied in very close details. And this, of course, connects to the second question, which is about valency. Because every culture will require a construction and reconstruction of values. And values, of course, are codes, codes which are created, transmitted, consumed across generations in a very intergenerational way. And that too requires this play between remembering and forgetting, how certain values get remembered again and again, and certain values get forgotten over time. And that becomes a very interesting reflection of ideological impulse, of dominant discourse, etc.
Yeah. Actually, there was a section where you mentioned forgetting also as a kind of memory. That was very interesting.
Exactly. I mean, unremembered. So again, we're looking at forgetting and memory, not exactly as dualistic categories, but as connected categories. In other words, if you want to remember something, you must be able to forget something as well. So,
and in literature also, we read the absences,
exactly.
the negation. So
Exactly.
there is a overlapping. Yeah. So I can read the other question. It comes from what you explained in your arguments. That is Praveen Kumar. It is a question from Praveen Kumar. Avishek, you mentioned that the use of expression post-truth is problematic. Would you please elaborate?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kumar. I think this is someone I met in Shimla just very recently. I'm very glad you attended this. So I think I find the notion of post-truth problematic in a very political way, because, you know, that is something which has come up post-2016. And if you want to locate it, post-truth and Donald Trump go hand in hand in a very interesting way. And my reservations against this term is because this term post-truth can be appropriated as well as misappropriated, very, in a very complex way. Because I've listened to arguments of scholars who look at post-truth as a natural extension of postmodernism. And I find that deeply problematic in many sense. Post-truth as a natural evolution of the postmodern debunking of grand narratives. I don't think there is such a seamless transition, and one needs to take a look at post-truth in very complex ways, through technology, through media, through the whole hijacking of narratives, etc. So I think one needs to take a look at post-truth through the very strong cultural context through which this word emerged, the term emerged, right? The American presidential election of 2016, what happened afterwards, etc. Because looking at post-truth as a cultural phenomenon which can be studied in a very scholastic way, it requires a very interesting analysis of the material conditions around which this particular term was used. So I have a little bit of trouble looking at post-truth as something which liberates us from the narrative of truth, right? Or looking at post-truth as something which emancipates us from looking at any version of truth. Because, you know, if we go back to one of the arguments we are having, and this is a question I often get asked, and that is, if there is no objective history, should we just say every version is acceptable, right? Every subjective story is acceptable because there is no dominant version, there's no objective version, there's no archival version. Should we reject all archival, objective, textbook versions of history because there is no reliable history? So my very commonsensical answer to that would be, we mustn't look at the objective data and the subjective experience as ontologically opposite of each other. They can actually inform each other in a very interesting way. The subjective can enrich the objective, and the objective can enrich the subjective, right? So I think the very lazy reception of post-truth as something which can emancipate us from the hegemony of any version, that I think is dangerous, politically as well as epistemically. So I'm a little careful with that term. I almost wrote an article on it, but I did not. Maybe I should go back on it, which was actually about this, making a very careful distinction between postmodernism and post-truth. So, yeah.
It's not only epistemologically dangerous, it's ontologically dangerous, particularly with climate change denial and really the invasion. It's propaganda that we're up against, not post-truth.
Absolutely.
Please write the article.
Thank you. I probably will.
So one other area related to this, particularly since I'm very intrigued by an entire field called memory studies, which, it's really inviting in a sense. And I see it in your work with regard to literature, to the literary, where, as you point out, we make memory through the literary, and we draw on memory in the literary to anticipate new futures, or even make possible new futures. And so it actually brought to mind somebody who Samrat and I share an interest in, and that's Bernard Stiegler. As his interest in technology for that reason, what he calls mnemotechnologies, the technologies of memory. And you were talking about the fact of the immortality or eternity of social media and other technologies of our time. And I think he plays exactly into that with his notion of mnemotechnology, which he calls epiphylogenesis or epiphylogenetic. They're phylae of themselves that are, outside us, but through which ontogenesis and even, human genesis is taking place today. But it can be misused and used. And his main problem, of course, is that it is being grossly misused as manipulating devices to flatten time, as you were, the two of you were talking about with regard to how we are given uniform versions of reality today. But at the same time, we have the ability to, use memory differently, to go back into time and create new futures and lineages, phylae of memory. So do you have something that you'd like to say about that, particularly the political? I think the way I read your book is that the literary creates the possibility space of overcoming that flattening, because you can actually step back and you can actually find your own freedom to manipulate these devices. Would you say that it enables that? Is that part of the message of your book?
I mean, that's a brilliant question, really, and I'm not sure if I have an adequate answer to this. One of the writers that I find very interesting in terms of someone trying to resist the ideological machine but failing is George Orwell. And I write in Orwell, there's a chapter I have when Orwell's own experiences in Burma, where he's an imperial agent. He's supposed to carry out the white man's work and kill people, shoot elephants, etc., etc. But what fascinates me about those essays, except that those are very politically incorrect, perhaps racist, that's what makes it interesting. But what fascinates me about Orwell's writings on Burma and the imperial engine is those moments of hesitation. I think hesitation is a very important device in literature, right? Where the subject is hesitating, should I get interpellated by the engines around me, or should I resist? Or should I just fail? And Orwell just fails. I mean, his fiction, the empire fiction of Orwell, is full of failed men, people who are like non-heroes, superfluous men in a Turgenev kind of way, but also people who try to resist but fail, and that de-glamorized depiction of the empire that Orwell has, which is exactly the opposite of the way the empire was, let's say, represented in the more consumable fiction around that time, is what I find fascinating. The whole idea of the literature, the literary device, as a device which not just allows us to transmit quotes, but also helps us to sort of decelerate quotes and interrupt the quotes. And I think we have had a lot of interesting study of defamiliarization. We can go back to Shklovsky and Russian formalists. But what I also find, something which hasn't been studied, perhaps not so sufficiently, and maybe I haven't read up enough about it, is to look at literature as a device of deceleration, slowing down the engines around you, slowing down the ideological engines, slowing down the scientific engines, slowing down the cultural machines around you. What happens when the subject manages to slow down? And one more writer I find fascinating, again, like Orwell, very politically incorrect, perhaps very racist, is Joseph Conrad. If we read Conrad's novels, novellas, and in a very banal way, if we think of something like Heart of Darkness, which is a 90-page novella, really. But I remember the first time I wanted to read it, it took me ages to finish it, because it is just so slow, and the language slows down everything. The empire engine slows down, and we were talking about liquidation earlier as well. It is entirely about liquidation. The human self gets liquidated, and what we have is a hollow dummy in the end, right, of Conrad. And this production of hollowness that Conrad does, and it's so painful, even to read, Heart of Darkness is so painful because it's just so notoriously slow. So I think the whole device of deceleration and hesitation that literature can accommodate through this very figurative, stylized play of language is something that warrants a lot of research attention. So yeah, that'll be my very inadequate response to your brilliant question.
Thank you very much.
I was also thinking about the notion of delay, because when we compare literature with technology, then it is also that we should also think about the difference, because in case of the modern teletechnologies, we actually try to erase the delay.
Exactly.
In every case of realism, we have the kind of tendency to erase the delay, but in case of literature, there is always the delay between the time when the writer has composed it and when the reader is reading it, and when he or she is interpreting. So there is this constant delay, and which carries on kind of difference in the Derridian sense.
Exactly. I mean, the time in which the story is written and the time in which it's read, there's a long delay, like you said. So ontologically speaking, in a very practical ontological way, the delay is accommodated in literature.
So I think if there are no more questions, we can go back with the memories of this wonderful discussion. Debashish da, what do you say?
Yes, Samrat, I think it was a very rich discussion, really wonderful. And I think really we opened up this really rich book, Abhishek's book. And I would encourage the viewers to look at the book, because I think it really offers a way of thinking about the literary that is necessary to our times. The question of delay with which you ended, I think, there is a constant pressure to erase the delay, right? This is the cusp that people read less and less. Of course, there's now the new culture of the smartphone, which has obliterated boredom in a sense, so that your Kindles and your smartphones give you the chance to read. But the question is, what do we read? And I think the ability, and I think it also ties into that issue about having a center of memory studies and of cultural interpretation within a technological institute, in our times, is the ability for people to engage with these questions. I think that's what, without that, it remains only an instrument of augmentation, as one might say. And to be able to feel that introspective, ability to go back in time and pull in new threads to decenter, the narrative is, I think, the only hope I can see for our times. So thank you so much, Avishek, and I think we can stop at this point.
Well, thank you very much for having me over. It's an absolute pleasure and honor. And I look forward to more formal collaborations between our Center for Memory Studies and the Posthuman Network. So hopefully we'll continue this conversation. And thank you for having me. An honor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Samrat, are you saying something? He's probably muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Avishek, again. And we look forward to collaborations and also more presentations, workshops, maybe on memory studies and the interface with posthumanism. And we will have this memory of the session and also the video, which will be attention memory of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Bye now. Take care.
Meet Avishek and have a good day. Debashish and others. Please, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.